course, I get to go last again. These guys said a lot of what I wanted to say, but I'll go through it. Anyway, and some of you who attended the workshops a couple weeks ago have seen some of this. We already saw the map. I was going to go talk about more of, so what does this mean as far as risk goes forward? Because I think they did a good job of showing how their pipelines are much different than some of the pipelines we looked at failure videos of and those types of things, but just still trying to help people wrap around risk a little bit. Certainly see the maps, you saw that earlier. Major pipeline systems, we've heard from most all of the major pipeline systems. You've already seen the graph of what the incident trends are, so you already have a sense that it's pretty low probability across 2.5 million miles of pipeline. Just to drill down to a little more local level, here's some significant incident data for Utah in specific. So this is for the gas transmissions, and as you can see, and I think this goes back, I think I went back 20 years, and there's only been 5 significant incidents on gas transmission pipelines in Utah in the last 20 years. If you go to distribution, there's been more, and this kind of follows the same national trends. You tend to see more. There's just way more gas distribution, and it shows the states. This stuff is all available, like I was talking about earlier, transparency. This is all federal incident data. It's all available easily on the federal website. And then when you get to the hazardous liquid, and it's cut off at the bottom a little bit, there's been even more, and part of that, as we discussed earlier, is a kind of a higher reporting threshold for hazardous liquid. I haven't had time now to kind of compare this to national records, but looking at it, it seems like there's nothing out of line, and in some ways it looks like the incident data here in Utah is lower than national stats. You also just have to think about the consequence, and you've seen a lot of this already, so I don't need to go through it, but certainly the consequence from spills and crude oil are the things you would think of. You know, there's the environmental harm, the potential public health harm, contamination of groundwater, surface water, and then there's just a huge liability that sometimes people don't think about, and you're going to hear more about this later at another session. But sometimes it's local government that creates some of these digging problems and ends up paying millions of dollars to fix things. Natural gas pipelines, fires, explosions, even some of we were just hearing about Kern River operating at very high pressures. This is a picture of a pipeline that there was no fire or explosion. That's just the pressure of the gas coming out of the pipeline, dug this hole, so just the pressure of the gas. This is the pipeline laying, 100 feet or so, maybe farther than that. And that was a large transmission pipeline. So even if nothing catches fire, there's a hazard. And liquid products is kind of a combination of the both. You get fires, explosions, and you also can get some pretty good environmental and soil contamination. This was a failure in Virginia, a jet fuel pipeline, where the people trying to get out of those homes actually were wading through jet fuel up to almost their knees trying to get out of there, and thousands and thousands of yards of soil had to be removed and gotten rid of after those things. The other thing is just what are the causes of incidents, and you've heard about this a little bit today. These are the national things. I'm just going to put up a couple of these pie charts. You can see nationally, looking at all the pipelines put together, there's kind of a variety of causes, with the biggest one being, material welds and equipment failure, followed closely by corrosion and excavation damage. If you drill down to Utah, you kind of start getting a little bit different sense. Here's the cause of just distribution, the small lines like Questar was talking about, the causes. The other problem, starting to looking at pie charts like this on causes locally, is you're dealing with a very small number of causes. Like all of this is for the last 10 years, since 2002, there's only been 12 significant incidents on distribution. So only takes 1 or 2 for one of those pieces of pie to grow quite significantly. But you can see it follows, certainly excavation damage is still a huge one, and then there's this 50% over here is outside force damage. And a lot of those, I think if I looked at the records right, were someone driving a vehicle into some piece of pipeline equipment. Hazardous liquid pie chart for Utah. We're only looking at 10 incidents over those last 10 years. Kind of the same big cause of a material weld equipment failure, a big catch-all with corrosion being, the second leading one. And then with gas transmission, very few, only 3 incidents in the last 10 years that qualify as significant. And they're all other causes, which is a catch-all about sometimes maybe it was an incident that happened so recently it hasn't been categorized yet, or they never figured out what it was, and then one incident in the material weld category again. When you try to wrap your head around risk, it's really a combination of the probability, what's the chance of it happening, versus the consequence. And so I tried to look at the data and just try to figure out what that means. And if you just statistically using national data locally, you would expect to see a significant incident on a gas line, gas transmission line in the Salt Lake Valley once every 21 years, and once every 25 years on a hazardous liquid pipeline. Now, statistics are an interesting thing. You can tell all kinds of stories with statistics. And so it doesn't mean much because those are based on national data. And as you heard here, the companies here are not national averages. They're real companies that do things differently. So I'm not sure the days mean anything. And if you even look at the Chevron spill, once every 25 years, you hit the jackpot twice in 6 months. So those types of statistical numbers are always somewhat hard to make sense of. And some people would think once every 25 years is good enough, and then they look at the pictures and not so much. For a lot of these pipelines, it's easy. It's especially the gas pipelines, it's pretty easy to come up with what's called a potential impact radius. There's an engineering calculation, and it's part of the regulations that you have to do within high consequence areas to figure that. This is in Fort Worth, Texas, and there's 2 gas pipelines running down this street. You can see the smaller line. If it failed there, this would be the potential impact radius where people standing in the open would be within harm's reach. The bigger pipeline has a much bigger radius. It kind of makes common sense, and that's another way to think about risk if you happen to live near one of these. Lots of ways to mitigate that. First most of making sure nothing happens with the pipeline to begin with. And I think that's all I wanted to just add to the discussion about who operates pipelines locally and what's the risk. So now we have some time for questions if anybody has any.